Woodhaven, a small, cozy, and tranquil town, like a postcard frozen in time. Modest houses with peeling paint, narrow cobblestone streets that still echoed the steps of horse-drawn carriages, and the old St. Saviour's Church all combined to create an atmosphere where the past seemed more significant than the future. The town always attracted visitors with its peace and quiet, a rarity in the hustle and bustle of big cities. At the very heart of Woodhaven stood the church, a spiritual and physical anchor of the community. Its old clock rang out every half hour, its chimes loud and clear, reminding the townsfolk of time's steady march. Overseeing it all was Pastor Edward Mason, a middle-aged man with thick streaks of gray in his hair and a voice that could both soothe and inspire hope. Edward wasn't just a spiritual leader, he was a friend, mentor, and confidant deeply respected by everyone who knew him. Edward's kindness and attentiveness were legendary. Stories of him helping repair houses, organizing drives for the needy, and even purchasing school supplies for children from underprivileged families circulated throughout the town. His reputation was flawless. So when he introduced his new assistant, Clara Rain, in 2019, the community welcomed her without hesitation. Clara was a delicate woman with fair hair she always kept tied back in a low bun. Her demeanor was so reserved that she seemed to fade into the background. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her voice was quiet, almost a whisper. According to Edward, Clara had gone through a difficult period in her life and needed a fresh start, a place where she could find peace. The townsfolk immediately sympathized with her. It was hard not to. Her slender frame and timid movements evoked a protective instinct in others. But from the beginning, there was something unusual about her behavior, something that most people overlooked. Only one person noticed, Elias Richardson. Elias, the town librarian, was a keen observer and deeply attentive to detail. His work in the library allowed him to notice things that often escaped others. Spending hours in the quiet of the library among books had sharpened his ability to pick up on subtle cues, a fleeting expression, a change in tone, a barely perceptible movement. At first, Elias, like everyone else, admired Edward's kindness, but something about Clara's situation seemed off to him. For starters, Clara almost never left the church. She carried out her duties, attended Sunday services, and helped with charity events. But outside of those occasions, she was never seen. Her movements were cautious, as if she was afraid to take a single step too far. While most townspeople chalked this up to her shyness, Elias began noticing something more. One particular incident caught his attention. During a charity event in the church courtyard, Elias noticed Clara suddenly freeze when she heard Edward's voice. Her shoulders tensed and her eyes dropped quickly to the ground. This wasn't the behavior of someone who simply respected her superior. It was the reaction of someone afraid. Determined to uncover the truth, Elias began visiting the church more often, coming up with reasons to be there, dropping off books for charity sales or simply stopping by to chat with Edward. But each time, his focus would shift back to Clara. Her movements seemed robotic, and her responses to questions felt rehearsed. Among the townsfolk, no one spoke of it. Clara was new, and her quirks could easily be attributed to adjusting to a new life. But a growing sense of unease gnawed at Elias. Though he didn't yet know where it would lead, he had already resolved to uncover the truth. With each passing day, Clara's behavior grew more enigmatic, deepening Elias's suspicions. He noticed that she never left the church alone, not even for a simple stroll through the town. Clara was always by Edward's side, following his instructions. Her face showed neither joy nor peace, only an unease masked by a polite smile. To the average Woodhaven resident, this seemed normal. A newcomer might naturally be a little reserved. But Elias wasn't convinced. One evening, as he often did, Elias visited the church under the pretense of donating a few books to the church library. It was late, and most of the townspeople had already retreated to their homes. The church was quiet, and faint light filtered through the stained glass windows. Leaving the books in the vestibule, Elias caught sight of Edward and Clara speaking in one of the side corridors. The scene lasted only a few seconds, but it imprinted itself in Elias's memory. It didn't look like a conversation between colleagues. Clara's movements were overly submissive, as if she feared doing something wrong. There were other details too, subtle ones that Elias noticed during his brief visits. Clara often wore the same clothes day after day, They were clean but unkempt, as if she didn't have the opportunity to change. Once, when she handed him some flyers for a charity event, Elias caught a glimpse of her wrist. It was reddened, as though rubbed raw by a bracelet or clothing. He found it strange but chose not to comment. These weren't mere trifles. Each observation added to a troubling picture that disturbed him more and more. The breaking point for Elias came when, even in the presence of others, Clara seemed to remain under some kind of constant supervision. During another charity event, as townsfolk dropped off donations, Elias noticed how Edward interacted with Clara. He saw the pastor grab her arm abruptly, lean in and whisper something while locking eyes with her. Though to an outsider this might have looked like a regular exchange, Clara's reaction told a different story. She nodded fearfully, then stepped back and quickly disappeared into the church. Elias froze, shocked by what he'd witnessed. He couldn't reconcile this behavior with the image of Edward as a kind, respected man. It contradicted everything he thought he knew about him, and Elias tried to rationalize what he'd seen. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Perhaps the situation wasn't as dire as it seemed. But Clara's constant anxiety, her avoidance of conversations with others, the fear in her eyes, it all pointed to something being very wrong. To gather more information, Elias began coming up with excuses to visit the church more frequently. He spent time speaking with the parishioners, asking about Clara, but no one could offer any concrete insights. Everyone agreed she was shy, and most didn't even notice her unusual behavior. This only reinforced Elias's belief that if anyone could see the warning signs, it was him. The following evening, Elias decided to stay near the church late into the night. He wanted to observe what happened when no one else was watching. Standing near the library across the street, he saw Clara emerge into the churchyard. She looked around nervously as though checking if anyone was watching her. For a brief moment, her eyes met his, and in that instant, Elias saw a plea for help in her gaze. That evening, as a thick fog enveloped Woodhaven, Elias was walking home after a long day at the library. The air was damp, and the faint glow of the street lamps barely pierced the white shroud of mist. As he strolled along the narrow street leading to his house, he noticed a figure hurrying in the opposite direction. It was Clara. She was walking quickly, almost running, clutching a small backpack in her hand. She looked distressed, as if uncertain about her decision. Over and over, she glanced back over her shoulder, as though afraid of being followed. Instinctively, Elias felt this was important. Without wasting time, he quickened his pace, trying to catch up to her. "Clara," he called out, but she didn't turn around. Her behavior was alarming. She picked up her pace, now nearly running, carefully sticking to the edge of the road. A street lamp illuminated her face for just a moment, and Elias caught the fear in her eyes. It seemed like she was battling panic. He tried calling her name again, but his voice caught in his throat. He was afraid he might frighten her even more. Before he could catch up, a dark car appeared from around the corner. It moved quietly, almost silently, but the scene unfolded as if in slow motion. The car stopped next to Clara, and Edward stepped out. Elias froze, remaining in the shadows. He didn't want to be seen and instead watched with bated breath. Edward walked toward Clara slowly while she took a few steps back. But realizing that running further was futile, she stopped. Elias saw Edward place a hand on her shoulder, seemingly in an effort to comfort her. But to Elias it looked like something more, something controlling. Clara seemed like she wanted to say something, but instead she simply lowered her head. After a brief exchange, Clara hesitantly walked toward the car. Her body language betrayed her hesitation. Her movements were slow and reluctant, as if she was being forced into a decision. Elias watched as the car door closed and the vehicle silently drove off, disappearing into the fog. The scene left Elias deeply unsettled. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to come together in his mind. When he returned home, Elias couldn't rest. His thoughts raced, torn between guesses and questions. He couldn't shake the look on Clara's face, a mix of fear and hopelessness. Why hadn't she called for help? Why had she simply obeyed? Something about her behavior convinced him that she was under control far beyond the ordinary. Elias resolved not to let it end there. He needed answers. The next day he called his colleague Megan, who worked with him at the library. Megan was one of the few people Elias trusted. He shared his observations, including the scene with the car, and voiced his suspicion that Clara might be in danger. "If that's the case," Megan said, "we need to be very careful. A wrong move could make things worse." They agreed to try speaking to Clara directly, but Elias knew this would be no easy task. He didn't know what to expect, but he felt he had no other choice. That unsettling night had only strengthened his belief. Clara needed help, and now he was prepared to risk everything to uncover the truth. The morning after the evening's events, Elias Richardson decided it was time to act. The things he had witnessed left a deep impression on him, forcing him to question everything he thought he knew about St. Saviour's Church and Pastor Edward Mason. He was convinced that Clara Rain was in danger, and his suspicions no longer left room for doubt. Elias set out for the church early in the morning. The town was still asleep, with only a few scattered residents passing by, nodding to him in greeting. The churchyard was quiet. A few old apple trees cast thick shadows, and a small garden where the church helpers often worked could be seen nearby. There Elias spotted Clara. She stood among the bushes, trimming branches with an old pair of gardening shears. Her posture was tense, her movements mechanical, like someone completing a task not out of choice but obligation. Her face, which Elias observed from a distance, was pale and focused, but utterly devoid of emotion. From his observations, Elias had noticed that Clara spent a significant amount of time in this garden. He assumed it might be the only place where she felt even a modicum of peace, away from whatever pressures lay inside the church walls. Yet even here her behavior seemed uneasy, her movements cautious, as though she feared drawing unwanted attention. He decided to seize the moment and gather more information. For weeks, Elias had been piecing together fragments of the story, but they weren't enough to fully understand what was happening. He stopped nearby, continuing to observe her. At one point, Clara put down the shears and gazed into the distance, standing still. She looked as though she was wrestling with her thoughts or battling inner doubts. Elias noticed another detail: her clothing. She wore the same simple gray dress he had seen her in before. It was clean but worn, suggesting limited options or a lack of freedom to change. It seemed as if her life was confined to only the bare essentials, all provided under Edward's control. As he stayed at a distance, Elias saw Clara suddenly glance back toward the church doors. Her movements were quick and nervous. She froze for a moment, as if checking to see if anyone was watching her. This moment further confirmed to him that she lived in a state of constant fear. After a brief pause, she returned to her work, but her movements became quicker and sharper, as if she was rushing to finish. Elias kept analyzing what he had seen. Everything pointed to one conclusion: Clara was under immense psychological pressure. Her avoidance of contact, her shyness, and her nervous behavior all suggested she was being controlled, or possibly even mistreated. As he walked away from the church, Elias recalled how he had once noticed bruises on Clara's wrists. He connected this memory to the scene he had witnessed the previous evening when Edward had grabbed her arm roughly. It no longer seemed like a coincidence. His gut told him Clara couldn't escape this situation on her own. Later that day, Elias decided to share his observations with his colleague Megan, who worked alongside him at the library. She was a rational thinker with a clear head, and Elias trusted her judgment. He described his suspicions and the night he saw Clara attempting to escape. He explained that he believed her situation was dangerous. Megan listened attentively. She agreed that the situation was troubling, but reminded him of the risks involved. Without solid evidence, any action they took could have serious consequences. Together, they resolved to try speaking to Clara directly, if they could find a safe moment to do so. Their next steps required caution. Elias understood that his suspicions were no longer just vague feelings, but he also knew that by intervening, he was risking not only his own position, but also Clara's safety. The following day, Elias Richardson continued to keep a close eye on Clara. He felt that a turning point was near. The events of the past few days had convinced him beyond a doubt that Clara Rain needed help. However, he still didn't know exactly how to proceed. Her behavior, constant avoidance of communication, and her apparent isolation painted a picture of someone trapped in a deeply unsettling situation. That day, Elias decided to take a risk. He carefully planned a meeting with Clara, one that could take place without Edward Mason's presence. He chose the morning, a time when the pastor was usually occupied with church services or their preparation. Elias knew that Clara often worked in the church garden, and he decided to use this as an opportunity. Leaving the library a little earlier than usual, he headed to the church. Approaching the garden, he saw Clara watering the flowers. She looked pale and exhausted, but her movements were quick, as if she was rushing to finish her task. Elias approached her slowly, careful not to startle her. She noticed him when he was almost beside her and froze. Her gaze, as usual, was filled with anxiety, but this time there was also a hint of cautious curiosity in her eyes. "Clara," Elias began gently, "can I speak with you for a moment? I promise it's important, and I mean no harm." Clara appeared conflicted but, after a few moments of hesitation, nodded and cautiously sat down on a nearby bench. Her arms were crossed tightly, as though she was trying to shield herself. Elias spoke in a calm and measured tone, explaining his growing concern about her well-being. He didn't accuse Edward outright, but mentioned the bruises he had seen on her wrists and how she had looked on the night of her attempted escape. After several minutes of silence, Clara finally began to speak. Her voice was quiet, but her words came out quickly, as though she feared she might be interrupted. She told Elias that Edward had been helping her adjust to her new surroundings, but his concern for her often crossed into excessive control, leaving her feeling deeply uneasy. She admitted that she had tried to leave several times, but Edward always found her and convinced her that she needed his support to survive. Despite his seemingly kind intentions, his behavior often left her feeling trapped. Her voice trembled as she described her confusion, her constant state of uncertainty, and her fear of upsetting him. Clara confessed that her recent attempt to escape had been an act of desperation. She didn't have a solid plan, but she had hoped to reach the nearest city and find help there. However, Edward always seemed to anticipate her intentions. She suspected that her every move was being watched and controlled, though she couldn't explain exactly how. Elias listened intently, and the full weight of her situation became clear to him. Clara wasn't just under someone's control. She was trapped in a psychological cage carefully constructed by Edward. When she finished speaking, Elias offered to help her escape. He assured her that she could find safety in the city and start a new life far away from Woodhaven. At first, Clara hesitated, her fear and doubt evident, but after a long pause, she finally nodded in agreement. Elias decided they had to act quickly. They planned to meet late that night at a time when Edward usually retired to bed. Clara was to quietly pack a few essential belongings and leave through the back door of the church. Elias promised to wait for her with his car near the old bridge on the outskirts of town. Throughout the day, Elias meticulously worked out the details of their escape plan. He knew the risks, but he was determined. This might be Clara's only chance to break free. Everything seemed to be falling into place, and by evening, Elias was confident they were ready. But as night fell, Elias would soon find himself facing something he could never have anticipated. The escape plan was simple and seemed foolproof. Elias waited for Clara near the old bridge, just as they had agreed. The evening was quiet, the air cool with a hint of moisture. His heart pounded in his chest, knowing that this attempt could be Clara's one chance to start a new life. His car was parked under the cover of trees, and he kept his eyes fixed on the road, straining to hear any sound. Finally, a figure emerged from the darkness. It was Clara. She carried a small backpack and looked so worn out that it seemed she might collapse at any moment. Her movements were cautious, and her face was tense. She climbed into the car, and Elias immediately started driving. Their route led them through desolate roads, heading toward the nearest city. Clara said almost nothing. She sat with her head down, clutching her backpack to her chest as if it were her only shield. Elias noticed her hands trembling and realized her condition was far worse than he had imagined. Around midnight, the car's fuel gauge warned that they were running low on gas. Elias had no choice but to stop at a small, old gas station on the side of the road. The station was almost abandoned, with flickering lights and a single cashier inside. The place was empty, which seemed like a safe option. Elias left Clara in the car and went inside to pay for the key. When he returned, Clara was no longer in the car. Her door was ajar and her backpack lay on the seat. Panic rose in his chest as he quickly looked around. He spotted her near the entrance to the gas station store, gesturing animatedly as she spoke to the cashier. Her movements were frantic, and her voice, though muffled, sounded urgent. Elias immediately felt that something was wrong. Hurrying toward them, Elias overheard the cashier speaking firmly. "The police are on their way to him." Elias froze. His worst fears were coming true. He turned to Clara, but her expression was different, completely different from anything he had seen before. The fear in her eyes was gone, replaced by determination. "He kidnapped me," Clara said to the cashier, her voice steady and convincing. "He forced me to leave with him." Her words hit Elias like a punch to the stomach. Her tone, her delivery, it all sounded rehearsed, deliberate. For a moment, Elias couldn't believe what he was hearing. He tried to explain, but the cashier held up a hand, dismissing him, and kept his fingers hovering over the phone. Within moments, flashing red and blue lights illuminated the gas station as the police arrived. Two officers stepped out of their car, instructing Elias to step back and put his hands up. Clara repeated her story to the officers, recounting how Elias had coerced her into leaving the church. Her voice was calm yet emotional, and she seemed entirely convincing. Elias, on the other hand, struggled to find the words to defend himself. Shock and confusion left him stammering incoherently. The officers, taking Clara's account at face value, placed Elias in handcuffs and guided him into the back of their car. Clara stayed at the gas station, portraying the role of a frightened victim. As the police car pulled away, Elias stared at Clara through the window. Her face was expressionless, unreadable. He could see her lips moving as she spoke to one of the officers, but the words were lost to him. His mind raced, filled with one burning question. Had this been her plan all along? The gas station sank back into silence as the patrol car drove off into the night. The flickering lights continued their intermittent hum, casting eerie shadows. Clara disappeared into the darkness, while the officers worked to piece together what had just happened. For Elias, however, it no longer mattered. He had been trapped, and the consequences of his actions were spiraling far beyond his control. After Elias Richardson's arrest, he was taken to the local police station, where an interrogation began. The police initially focused on Clara Rain's testimony, which sounded clear and convincing. She claimed that Elias had abducted her from the church, forced her into his car, and attempted to flee with her to the city. Her tone was composed, and her account was detailed. She insisted that she had been too afraid to ask for help earlier because, according to her, Elias had threatened her. The police took her words seriously, as her story had an internal logic, and her demeanor matched that of a frightened victim. Clara appeared exhausted, her hands trembling, her eyes red from what looked like constant stress. However, as the officers began to dig deeper into her claims, inconsistencies started to emerge. First, they noticed Clara's reluctance to answer questions about her time at the church. She repeatedly emphasized Elias's supposed control over her, but avoided mentioning anything about Pastor Edward Mason, who had been her primary caretaker. The officers began to suspect that Clara was hiding something, though they couldn't yet determine what. Meanwhile, in another room, Elias sat silently, waiting for his turn to speak. He was stunned by the events that had unfolded, unable to reconcile what had just happened. His attempt to help Clara had turned into a disaster. He couldn't understand whether her actions were part of a carefully laid plan or a desperate, impulsive decision. All he knew was that he was now trapped, with the evidence and testimony stacked against him. When the interrogation began, Elias tried to explain his version of events. He described Clara's attempted escape from the church days earlier, their conversation in the garden, and the control Edward seemed to exert over her. He insisted that his intentions had been purely to help her, but to the police, his words sounded like an attempt to justify his actions. Without concrete evidence to support his claims, his story was weak. The case took a new turn when the police decided to investigate Clara's background. During their research, they discovered that Clara had a history of mental health issues that affected her perception of reality. Records showed that she had been a patient at several psychiatric facilities before arriving in Woodhaven. These documents revealed diagnoses of paranoia and a tendency to distort reality. These revelations cast doubt on her testimony, but they did not clear Elias of suspicion. The police continued to treat him as a suspect, reasoning that someone could have taken advantage of Clara's vulnerabilities to manipulate her. The investigation also began to focus on Edward Mason. The police visited the church to gather more information about his relationship with Clara. What they found, however, was unexpected. Edward was missing. No one in the congregation had seen him since the day Clara disappeared. His phone was turned off, and there were no clues to his whereabouts. In Edward's office at the church, the police found letters and notes that shed some light on his intentions. The documents revealed that he had been deeply involved in Clara's life, claiming it was his duty to protect her from the outside world. Some of the writings took on a religious tone, bordering on fanaticism, and suggested that he believed Clara's well-being depended entirely on his guidance. Despite these findings, the police struggled to piece together a cohesive narrative. Everyone involved, Clara, Elias, and the missing Edward, seemed to be entangled in a web of secrets and contradictions. Ultimately, Elias was officially charged with involuntary abduction. The lack of evidence proving malicious intent spared him from harsher charges, but his involvement in the situation was undeniable. He was sentenced to probation and community service. However, the trial and its outcome left a lasting stain on his reputation. As for Clara, she was sent to a psychiatric hospital for further treatment. Her story about the escape and Edward's control over her lost credibility after the police uncovered her mental health history. Still, doctors confirmed that her condition had deteriorated significantly during her time at the church. As for Elias, his quiet, routine life had been irreversibly changed. He remained haunted by the question of whether he had done the right thing. The case of Elias Richardson went to trial, and it became a major topic of conversation in Woodhaven. The once quiet and peaceful town was now divided. Some were convinced of Elias's guilt, believing his attempt to flee with Clara confirmed it. Others thought he had been deceived or misunderstood, arguing that he had always been a respected and dedicated member of the community. In court, Clara Rain was the prosecution's key witness. She repeated her version of events, claiming that Elias had tricked her into getting into his car and threatened her if she refused to leave with him. Her testimony was emotional, and she appeared to be reliving traumatic memories. Yet the defense attorney for Elias challenged her account, pointing to her psychiatric history and past diagnoses. During the trial, Clara's medical records were presented, revealing her struggles with mental health, including paranoia and a tendency to distort reality. These details cast significant doubt on her testimony. However, the prosecution argued that even someone with mental health issues deserved protection and that Elias could have exploited her vulnerability. Elias himself remained calm during the trial, but appeared deeply burdened. He reiterated his version of events, emphasizing that he had acted with good intentions and only wanted to help Clara escape Edward Mason's control. He described their conversations in the church garden, her visible fear, and how she had agreed to the escape plan. But without tangible evidence to back up his claims, his words didn't carry much weight. The situation grew even more complex when the police officially announced Edward Mason's disappearance. The pastor, who had been the central figure in Woodhaven's community for years, had vanished on the same day Clara left the church. His phone was disconnected, and no trace of him could be found. During their investigation, police uncovered more about Edward's relationship with Clara. In his office at the church, they found notes and letters suggesting that he had isolated her intentionally. Some writings hinted at a fanatical belief that he alone could save her, while others suggested a darker, controlling side to his care. Despite these revelations, the full truth remained elusive. Every person involved, Clara, Elias, and the missing Edward, seemed to carry their own secrets, and no one's account fully explained the events. In the end, Elias was convicted of involuntary abduction. While the court acknowledged that there was no evidence of malicious intent, it concluded that his actions had caused significant harm. He was sentenced to probation and community service. However, the trial had already taken a heavy toll on his life. Most of the townspeople lost trust in him, and his once strong reputation was shattered. Clara was sent to a psychiatric hospital for ongoing treatment. The police investigation revealed that her mental state had deteriorated significantly during her time in the church. The congregation dwindled, and the community failed to find a new leader to unite them. Elias, once a man who cherished his quiet, routine life, now lived in a town where he was no longer welcome. He constantly questioned whether he had done the right thing. Should he have stayed out of Clara's situation entirely? Or had his intervention, however flawed and disastrous, been necessary to expose the truth? Clara, too, remained a tragic figure. Though she was now receiving the care she needed, her story had left a lingering shadow over Woodhaven. She had been both a victim and a catalyst for the unraveling of a tightly knit community. In the end, there were no heroes in this story. It was a tale of mistakes, misplaced intentions, and unforeseen consequences, leaving everyone involved forever changed.